It's been a few weeks since we broke ground on our South American building here at Wildlands Zoo. In that time, things have been progressing quite well. Materials are arriving, contractors are booked, and general progress has not really impacted the visitors to the zoo. One Lord Coltham is not known for his patience, however, and has been driving the project forward possibly quicker than it ever really needed to go. He's already booked the delivery of 2 giant otters from his South American journeys, and they arrive in just a few weeks. With that, the crunch is on. It's time to get the building up, get the outer walls filled in, and get an actual livable habitat for the new otters. In today's episode, we're going to do just that. It's unlikely we'll be done. It's unlikely the guests will have anywhere to enter and use, but at least we will have the first of our habitats for our big South American building. Now, before we jump on into today's episode, if you love otters as much as I do, hit the like button. If you don't love otters as much as I do, you clearly must love them more, so also hit the like button. Today's engagement emoji is the duck. No, I'm kidding. It's an otter. It's an otter. Pop an otter in the comments below. Come on, guys. It's an otter. And with that done, let's go. So, this was quite the undertaking. Took a lot longer than I thought. We are going to jump quite speedily through the first few parts of it. All I'm really doing is following the outline that we set up last episode and just making sure the water fills it. And then we're going to, again, just mark out different areas following that guide with the glass barriers. Now, these glass barriers will eventually be removed once we've got the land in the right place. But for now, it's just that we can make sure that the water goes where we want it to go. Now, the idea here is that we're going to have this big central landmass and the water's going to surround it completely. So now that we've got the water all at the height that we need it to be, we can start building up that landmass again using that guide. As you can see here, we're just going to build out all the way around. Now, the habitat within the other areas, the areas that aren't the otters, we'll come back to, but the important part is to get all the underwater section done, because removing and adding the water in these sections once the habitat is in and once the barriers are down is going to be an absolute nightmare. So what we kind of want at this stage is just to get majority of the shape correct. And it's with that in mind we're doing a lot of these alterations. Now, with that done, as you can see here, we've managed to get the water going all the way around and just enough habitat landmass for what we need. Moving on, we're going to take a loan out because we're going to need it. And then we're going to start placing in the walls. Again, we're using the same template we used last time. A lot of this is just following the lines. And we're going to do it in the Indonesian brick because I want it to look a little bit more premium. We're going to make that a limestone white. And again, we're in the UK, so we've got to be careful about not using too much of this. It's incredibly hard to get a hold of. And then we're going to add some exterior detail using pillars. I don't want this building to be too fancy from the outside. It's got to look new. The idea is that you're meant to walk in and just be amazed by the look of the inside, and the outside needs to hide a lot of what it contains. Now, to tidy up the inside, we're going to cover everything in a fresh layer of plaster, and that's going to allow us to sink things into the wall. And then for the backstage area that you will be able to see through the habitat, we're going to clad that in these twilight bricks, textured like slate. Now, because I want to plant a lot of this wall up, possibly next episode, I'm going to sink some temple bricks into this, and this will just give us little ledges that we can spring a lot of vegetation from. Won't be getting around to that this video, but next episode we're going to go back and just go over a lot of these other parts as we make our second habitat in here. With that now done, you can see just on the left there, I've sort of marked out the backstage area with some painted bricks, and then we're just going to run our roof line along, and then we're going to start on our glass. Now, on the front of the building and on the side, I'm going to use one-way glass to give us some polarized glass. Now, this will be there to trap a lot of that sunlight in the building, but also provide a lot of shade to the guests when they're inside. It's going to be quite heavy on the glassware on the ceiling. We're going to frame that out with some metal beams, European marquee beams, and then we're also going to bring in some metal girders just to add a little bit of window trim. It also hides a lot of those ugly connections. Now for the floor. I did want to do quite a patterned floor, but then the more reference material I looked at, buildings like this tend to have these pre-manufactured commercial sort of screeds that are just put down and polished. I get it, it makes it easier to clean, it's a lot more durable. So we're going to go with the concrete, but we're going to colour it. I started off with a dark blue, but then I kind of went for like a green tint just to reflect some of that natural greenness in the water. Now to fill in some of the gaps, we're going to make some planting areas. Now I wanted this raised platform for hiding the otter tube, which I'll go into how that works later on. For that, it meant that we had these rather ugly connections where the stairs met the floor and then where the floor had these curbs and edges, which you unfortunately can't turn off. So in come the good old planters, where we'll hide a lot of those joints, and then we're going to cover the stairs in some floor just so they're the right colour. I don't like the idea of the guest's feet sinking too much into the floor here, so I've been very careful to make sure we only go as deep as we need to. But as you can see there, it just ties everything in a little bit more neater. We're then going to use some mulch, and the use of these planters with some mulch is a brilliant way to hide all of those ugly little mistakes that you just don't want to spend time fixing, especially where the path system comes into it. Those of you experienced with the path system will know just how annoying it can be at times. Now this is a very wet, humid building. You would expect there to be a build-up of moisture and possibly a lot of wet floors. So we're going to make some treads for the stairs using the vents, some metal beams just to trim them off. I will expand on this later on. I kind of wanted to make stairs like these going on some of the other buildings. This was the first time trying it out. Really happy how it looked. Now onto the most expensive part of the entire build, and that is going to be our roof support beams. So we're using some metal tubes here to make a metal beam thick enough for what I want, and these are going to go from the floor to the ceiling and hold up our habitat edges, or the mesh that covers the side of the habitat. We're going to make a concrete footing so it's got a nice bit of sturdiness at the bottom as though it's been molded into the floor, and then we're going to create a connector. Now these connectors are going to stretch out from these beams to the glass and hold the structure that floats above the glass. This will make more sense as you see us make the structure. Now this time around I wanted to make something a little bit more realistic and a little bit lifelike. So using some reference images, I've started to make this sort of steel construction that would normally be used to hold up steel beams of this nature. It basically is made up from these giant metal triangles that clamp a giant steel beam and would normally be welded to it, and that provides enough structural rigidity that it can then lean across longer lengths to hold up the structure that it's going to be supporting. So we're going to place a giant steel beam in between these two sort of claw shapes made from hinges, and again in reality these would be welded together. We're then going to make this structure work its way all the way around this pole, and it would be attached on both sides, and then there'll be two arms that come out and meet up with what we're going to build next, which is our main sort of mesh siding to the habitat. Now for all those of you following along in habitat mode with these builds, just be aware this is what ate up a huge amount of cost. So you'll notice down the bottom left we're at sort of 37,000. Each one of these connectors, not the pole, just the connector on its own, cost about 1,500. There is roughly 4 to 5 of them per pole, and there's roughly 5 to 6 of the poles per side. So by the end of it, it ended up eating up most of our 50,000 that we took out as a loan. All I'm doing in the background there is just adding a little bit of detail with the grasslands pole, and then we're going to make these little grabby hands that stick on the end where it meets up with the other structure. Now before we get them into place, we're going to pop some of the brace plates in the floor to make some rivets and attach them to a girder. And these are just going to run as though they've been bolted to the floor up the edge of the glass, roughly every sort of 10 meters. So it's about 2.5 of the 4-meter wall pieces. That's kind of how I measured it out when we made the template. It's not exact, but it's near or near enough that they don't look too out of scale to each other. And then along the top, we're going to use this roof trim, which is a base game asset. I believe it's called the vertical roof trim. It is the closest thing I've ever seen in this game to long strips of UPVC plastic, and it's brilliant. And I only found it for this build, and I need to use it more. Moving on now, we're going to start building our mesh structure. So the idea here is that the lower area is going to be where the glass sits, and it shows you the underwater area of the river. And then the upper area is just sectioned off by this mesh that holds up a couple of glass panels just to stop some splashing. This is very industrial. The whole style of this building is very industrial, and it looks far better than I ever imagined it was, certainly when I started building it. This took a very long time, and there was a lot of metal involved, but it really was worth putting the time into. So as you can see here, we're just going to make these little standoffs, and then it means that the walls of the habitat sit further in. It's going to create a gap between the glass and the metal, and that means that the guests would be able to hear the water, they'd be able to smell the smells of the habitat, they'd be able to sort of feel the spray of the water as it comes over the side. It's a lot more immersive, and it's a brilliant way of interpreting the habitat and the feel of being close to the animal. With that lower framework built, we're now going to build up and across, and then we're going to start sectioning it up into squares. And this is all just using the European marquee beam, building across, and as you can see there, we're left with this checkerboard of metal. Now, it was about this stage that I was starting to think, okay, yeah, this is working, this is looking good. So we're going to go ahead and just pop in some glass. We're just going to line those seams up as best as we can with the metal joints. It won't always work, but as long as you get them nice and lined up with something, they tend to look okay. And now we're going to make a little protective fence that's going to run along the bottom. And this is just going to be made out of the cable pole for thickness. And then we're going to use the grasslands pole for steel cable. By combining those two together, we're going to make this little fence that just stops people throwing things in or stops the otters climbing out through the gap. As an aside, it's these sort of details that took the time. I can't imagine it without these on there. It really does make the whole thing, just elevates it a little bit more. Now what we're also going to do with these is, once we've got this bottom one done, is we're going to duplicate it and we're going to lift it up, and on each level put in these sort of protectors. We don't really need them after the second level, but I think it just adds a little bit more complexity to the build, and it makes it look busier, which I think really works. Then with those in, we can start placing our big beams and our connectors. So we're going to place the beams first, get them to the right height, and they're going to reach all the way up to the roof on both sides. In fact, all three sides of the habitat here. And we're just going to nudge them into place so that they sit with the connectors. And the connectors we're then going to line up to meet up with the metal beams on each level. Now this whole build takes advantage of what I think is Planet Zoo's, or one of Planet Zoo's very best abilities with its engine, and that is the shadows and the lighting on each area. Just look at how good that looks. Now, one final little bit of detail before we get onto the rest of the building. I saw in some reference photos the idea of using these sort of big blocks of different heights coming out of the floor, and this would allow children, adults to sort of sit down but also stand on them so they can see over the water level. I love that idea. It fits in so well. It sort of just comes out the floor. It works really well with that industrial feel, and yeah, they work so well. The guests won't use them, obviously, but I think just having them there, for me, it just seems like a really good idea. Back to the outside of the building then. Now that we've got the inside sorted, we know where we can put our roofs. We're just going to use the plain Planet Zoo asphalt roofs for this. I don't want it to look overly special. I don't want it to look overly flamboyant. I just want it to be a normal roof. So that's what we're going to put on. That down, we can finish off cladding the inside with the plaster. Just hides all of those messy overlaps and makes it look all very neat and tidy. Now for the outside, again, to keep some of that heat inside and also as a visual detail for the front of the building, we're going to make ourselves some very fine mesh. Done that by just duplicating the square mesh repeatedly and moving it ever so slightly so that it just crosses over. As you can see there, it gives us a very, very fine mesh. It turned out really well. Now we're going to frame that in some European metal, attach it to the front of the building and set it so it runs about 4/5 of the height of the windows. Then we're going to bolt it in so it's a little bit more permanent and run it along the widths of each of the windows, just as a more permanent fixture. With that then attached, we're also going to come along and pop on a couple of banner poles. These won't be in use this episode, but towards the final episode before we do our tour, we can unveil each of our animal photos on these banner poles, ready for our grand opening. With that done, we're going to make a bit of time for our roof. Now, as you can imagine, this is going to be a lot of glass. What I didn't want was just to use the normal glass, so instead I made a metal frame just to add a bit more detail. This is just using the metal tubes, and we're going to run it all over the top of that roof. Now, 15 or so minutes later for you, about 30 hours for me, we can finally get on to building a habitat for the otters. So I've turned the fencing over to a chain link fence so I could map it out with rock. Then we're going to flip it back to a null barrier, and that will give us the outline of where we have to plant. I'm going to pop a couple of rocks inside. We've got to be very careful with these habitats. There's not a huge amount of space. We're very much on the line right from the planning stage, just enough land space for these animals. So we don't want to take too much of it up. That just means we've got to be a bit clever with the planting. So we're using some nice big feature plants, big log, and then I'm going to make our first big feature tree of this building, which is going to be our strangler fig. We'll use this one going sideways with its top slowly arcing back up towards the roof. And then we're going to attach the little one to it as though it's a side sprout, and that just gives us what I didn't think it would turn out this well, but I just love how it looks, and it is a brilliant first tree. Really happy with it. Couple of big ferns just to drag your eye. The idea is that you should be able to see right through this whole habitat into the other habitats, so we don't want to block our sight lines too much. Then we're going to cover it in fig tree roots and a couple of little bromeliads just to add a bit of green. Now the underwater section on this is just as important as the upper section. So we're going to pop down some nice big rocks. We're going to colour these the same colour as the water so that they blend in and add a bit of shadow. And then we're going to paint on some texture. Now the otters love sand, so we're going sand pretty much everywhere. A little bit of glass, a little bit of dirt, but mostly sand. Now jumping back to what I was saying earlier about the otter tunnels, so the idea here is that through the back of these exhibits, which are more than likely going to be water exhibit, you should be able to see the otters swimming along and going out to their outside enclosure. So I've sort of built the water level up to 2/3 of the height of the exhibit, and then we're just going to hide that in with a lot of rock and some planting. We're not going to put anything in here this episode, we will in the future, but for now this is just to house them in, and I think I needed a little bit of a break while I was doing this. I needed a break to go do some planting, so I did the exhibits. Moving outside, we're going to use my good old riverbank trick that I used in the Antara series, that is to place down some of these aquatic trees, stagger them across the riverbank, and then use the tropical stone to create a ledge above them. And I think this worked really well back then, and I still love how it looks now. Then just to finish it off, we're going to scatter a couple of roots just poking out just to add a bit of detail. The outer areas are less about what's going on under the water and more about the riverbank feel for these giant otters. You can somewhat see a little bit underwater, but not a huge amount. What I will do off camera is I will go and add a load of vegetation to the back here just to hide that backstage building. For the underwater viewing, there's going to be a little bit, and we're going to just frame it in this Asian wood. We want this to look very rustic. It's just there's a little window that you can see sort of diagonally down into the water. But a lot of this is going to be hidden by planting, and you'll see a lot of that in the cinematics at the end here. We are going to build another little fence because we've not got a huge amount of barrier there, and this fence will just stop people throwing rubbish into our little river here, and also again just stop the otters from jumping on out. We're going to use the same idea as we did inside, the cable for the main pole and then the grasslands pole for the steel wire. Now what I did off camera, as you'll see in some of these cinematics here, is I also then went on and built a complete backstage. But I'm not going to focus on that because we are going to change that in a future episode. This was just more so that we didn't have otters escaping everywhere. As you can see, I'm really happy how this turned out. The view on the inside, all of that metal, it matches exactly what I had in my head, and most of the time when I make these habitats, I have a fair idea how I want it to look, but it never really transcribes as well as this did into the actual game. Now we do still need a name for the building here, so do please pop down in the comments below your names for our South American building. It needs to be somewhat related, it needs to be very zoo-like. I may end up putting a poll up of all my favourites on the channel community board, and then I'll let you guys choose what we're going to call it. As you've probably guessed, this habitat, this building, this South American area is nowhere near finished, and honestly I didn't think I'd be able to get the otters into this today. I had to kind of race towards the end with it just to make sure that we got there on time. Next episode we are going to be introducing a few more animals, but we're also going to be reworking this area as we go through, so that rock wall at the back of the habitat, that will be increased. The landscaping on the outer area, that will be redone. All of that's going to be part of the series as we go forwards. It's probably going to take a couple of episodes to get this all finished, and obviously we have got a download content due around the corner, and there are whispers that may include some more South American animals. With that in mind, if you like what we did today, and my god do I like what we did today, please hit the like button down below and don't forget to subscribe to see where we go with it. Really happy to hear all your feedback in the comments below. I can't wait till next week when we'll have another chunk of this building completed. I hope you're enjoying the series. However, for now, that's all I've got for you. Hope you enjoyed it. I will see you next week. Bye guys.